Let's just jump right into this explainer, because today we are looking at the absolute paradox that is America's 13th president, Millard Fillmore. You know, we usually think of compromise as a good thing, right? A political virtue. But as we're going to see, sometimes it's the exact thing that ends up tearing a nation apart. When we think about the era right before the Civil War, we picture a country that's inevitably fracturing. But sitting right there, smack in the eye of that gathering storm, was a guy who genuinely believed he could just legislate the crisis away. Fillmore's time in office is literally a masterclass in the unintended consequences of political maneuvering.
Just to wrap our heads around this, we have to start with a really striking contradiction. How does a man who personally helped freedom seekers eventually turn around and enact the harshest fugitive slave law in American history? Back in the early 1840s, when he was living up in Buffalo, New York, Fillmore actually aided a runaway named Milton Clark. He harbored him, gave him money, and even acted as pro bono counsel for alleged fugitives, saying it was his moral duty. And yet, skip ahead just a few years, and he's putting his presidential signature on a law that made those exact actions a federal crime. It's wild.
To untangle all this, here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover his accidental presidency, the Compromise of 1850, the notorious Fugitive Slave Act, his move to open Japan to trade, and finally, his run with the Know Nothing campaign.
Let's kick things off with his accidental presidency.
This summer of 1850 was incredibly chaotic. President Zachary Taylor, who was actually fighting against a massive legislative compromise over slavery, suddenly dies of cholera. Boom. Just like that, the very next day, Vice President Fillmore is inaugurated. Now, knowing Fillmore actually supported the compromise, Taylor's entire cabinet completely bails. They all resign unanimously. So Fillmore has to immediately pivot the whole administration. He brings in pro-union, pro-compromise Whigs, including the legendary Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, just to stabilize things. And by September, the legislative dam totally breaks, and Fillmore is signing these world-changing bills into law.
Which brings us right into the Compromise of 1850.
At this point, the U.S. had just scooped up a massive amount of territory from the Mexican-American War, and Congress was quite literally having fistfights over whether these new lands would allow slavery. It was incredibly tense. So, Senators Henry Clay and Stephen A. Douglas step in and engineer these distinct bills to basically balance the scales. It was a massive, grand bargain. The North gets California as a free state, plus they abolish the slave trade right in Washington, D.C. The South gets popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico, debt relief for Texas, and, this is absolutely crucial, a radically strengthened Fugitive Slave Act.
Now, Fillmore genuinely believed this compromise was it, a final settlement. He thought by giving a little something to everyone, he had permanently saved the Union from a civil war. And honestly, people were celebrating in the streets of Washington. But, as we're about to see, the very glue he intended to hold the country together actually became the exact wedge that drove it apart.
That wedge, of course, was the Fugitive Slave Act. To really grasp why this was such a big deal, you have to look at the sheer legal imbalance here. The Fugitive Slave Act essentially stripped away every single fundamental right from suspected runaways. We are talking zero due process, no jury trials, no habeas corpus, and they couldn't even testify to defend themselves. And then on the flip side of that, you have federal commissioners who were literally financially incentivized to rule in favor of slaveholders. They got paid a higher fee for a capture than they did for a release. Plus, if any law enforcement officer refused to make an arrest, they got hit with a staggering $1,000 fine.
These incredibly severe penalties were explicitly designed to force the North to comply. But guess what? It totally backfired. It sparked this furious, massive backlash. Northerners, who maybe hadn't cared that much about the slavery issue before, were suddenly being told by the federal government that they had to actively participate in hunting down human beings. It legally transformed everyday citizens into reluctant slave catchers. As you can imagine, the moral outrage was just immediate. The real-world enforcement of this law was just brutal. Take James Hamlet. Just days after the law passed, he's grabbed right off the streets of New York and shipped south without any trial whatsoever. Up in upstate New York, William Harris and his family literally jumped overboard into a canal just to escape the people chasing them, and tragically his child drowned in the process. And maybe most chilling of all, a free man named Adam Gibson in Philadelphia was sent south even after witnesses definitively proved he was free. He only got released because the guy down in Maryland he was delivered to honestly admitted that Gibson wasn't his slave. This wasn't some abstract legal debate. It was destroying real lives in real time.
The anger directed at Fillmore from abolitionists and his former allies was intense. Just listen to this blistering newspaper critique from 1856. He was basically viewed as a Northern man who had completely sold out to Southern interests. Now, the crazy thing is, Fillmore personally hated slavery, but he prioritized the survival of the Union above literally everything else. By rigidly enforcing this specific law, though, he effectively destroyed his entire reputation up north and guaranteed he'd be the very last Whig president in American history.
All right, let's pivot away from domestic turmoil and look at foreign policy, opening Japan to trade.
The administration's massive pivot toward the Pacific wasn't random. It was driven by some very clear economic and strategic goals. Think about it. Now that the U.S. had acquired California, it was officially a Pacific power. The world was transitioning from sail to steam, which meant ships desperately needed coal. And on top of that, the booming American whaling industry needed safe harbors. But for over 2 centuries, Japan had strictly isolated itself from the West. Fillmore just decided, okay, it's time to change that, and he authorizes a major formal naval expedition to force the issue.
In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry rolls into Tokyo Bay. And he doesn't just show up. He arrives with a squadron of advanced, smoke-belching steamships. It was a very deliberate show of overwhelming military tech. He hands over a letter straight from President Fillmore, demanding they protect shipwrecked sailors and open up ports for refueling. The Japanese authorities, taking one look at this advanced weaponry and realizing they couldn't repel it, grudgingly accepted. This incredibly bold maneuver directly paved the way for Japan to open its source to the world, ultimately sparking its rapid modernization.
Finally, we have to look at his post-presidency with the Know Nothing campaign.
Because the fallout from the Fugitive Slave Act essentially destroyed the Whig Party, Fillmore was left looking for a new political home. So he ends up aligning himself with a fringe movement called the American Party, better known as the Know Nothings. This was a highly secretive, really extreme movement that was totally obsessed with stopping Catholic immigration, basically blaming foreign influence for all the nation's problems. I mean, for a former president of the United States to head a ticket based entirely on nativist exclusion, that is a stunning footnote in American history. It just goes to show how deeply fractured the political landscape had become.
8. That is the grand total of electoral votes Fillmore actually managed to win in the 1856 presidential election. It was a dramatic fall from grace. Even though he won over 40% of the popular vote in the South, he was completely wiped out in the North. Tying himself to that harsh Fugitive Slave Act and then the nativist Know-Nothings alienated vast swaths of the electorate. By the time he died in 1874, almost all his achievements were largely forgotten by a country that had just endured the exact same civil war he sacrificed his entire political career trying to prevent. So we're left with this really provocative question about the ultimate butterfly effect of Fillmore's choices. Did the Compromise of 1850 save the Union, or did it guarantee its violent fracture? On one hand, by delaying the Civil War for a decade, did Fillmore buy the North the crucial industrial time it needed to eventually win? Or did his rigid enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act inflame sectional hatreds so deeply that a peaceful resolution became entirely impossible? Millard Fillmore remains this incredibly complex, paradoxical figure, a man who gave away his own legacy in a desperate, deeply flawed attempt to keep America whole.